position that Suhail has defined through his writing and teaching over a number of years. Suhail's work addresses political economy, theory, and the axioms of contemporary art. He holds a readership in critical studies at Goldsmiths London, where he is also programme co-director of the MFA in Fine Art. And for the last academic year, Suhail has been a visiting fellow at the Centre for Curatorial Studies at Bard College, New York. So Suhail's talk tonight will introduce the central argument within this series of presentations. The intent behind programming this four-part thesis is to allow for a more considered development and discussion of his ideas, and we hope you'll be able to join us for the following 3 presentations. As I say, there's going to be one every 2 weeks now for the next 6 weeks. So each talk will be followed by responses from invited participants, and this evening we're very pleased to be also joined along with Suhail by curator Jenny Jaski, who's curator at the Artists Institute. She's also currently editing a publication with Suhail, and I'll also be joining in as a respondent as well after Suhail's talk. So the format is basically that Suhail will speak for around 20 minutes, I reckon. 40 minutes, a slow speaker. And then we'll go into some discussion between Suhail, myself and Jenny, and then we'll open up to questions and discussion afterwards. So over to you, Suhail.
Okay, thank you, Richard. Thanks for the intro. Is the mic working? Now it's working. Okay. Thank you, Richard, for the intro and also the opportunity to do these talks at Artist Space. It's a great pleasure, and for that reason, being at Artist Space rather than a pleasure, also quite intimidating to do these talks and to present this line of inquiry into the conditions and horizons of contemporary art here, and also the need to exit contemporary art. As Richard said, I was going to be speaking for about 30 or 40 minutes. And before I start the talk itself, I just want to make some preparatory comments to give a sense of the terms of engagement with contemporary art, which I'll be presenting in this series. These talks will not turn to rely on or draw upon particular art for its argument. The argument is organized rather, as Richard said in his introduction, it's organized around the axioms of contemporary art, which is to say it's directed towards the conditions and logic by which the terms of contemporary art get their meaning and operational effects. Okay, so it's around the conditions and logic of contemporary art. And there's 2 points to be made initially. The first is that the issue is establishing that contemporary art does indeed have a logic, and it can be identified, and I think this is counterintuitive but correct. The second point is that the terms of contemporary art are sometimes the artworks, but not always, and not necessarily so. There are also the commonplaces, the idiolects, the received ideas, the judgments, the justifications, the social and administrative quasi-structures, the power operations and so on that constitute contemporary art as a field of activity. Okay, so not just the artworks, but the field of contemporary art. The claim of these talks is that these diverse effects constitute a coherent field of activity, organized around the indeterminacy of contemporary art, and which, as a field, draws its legitimations from the affirmation of indeterminacy. And the affirmation of indeterminacy not just for the art, but also as an ethos of contemporary art as a field of activity. So this indeterminacy, which I'm saying is central for artwork itself as contemporary art, but also for the field of contemporary art, this indeterminacy enables all sorts of benevolence, as well as all sorts of abuses of power at every level, from the very large institutions to micro-relational relations, I guess. So to summarize the preparatory remarks, the subject of these talks is not artworks and it's not artists. The latter, artists and artworks, are now not where the action is, I suspect not even primarily for contemporary art. For example, this argument is in art, even if it's not art itself. And I'm pretty clear it's not art itself. As a discussion, second subpoint, as a discussion of art's axioms, the claims made here are totalizing or concern the dominant forms of the field. But that does not mean that the axioms or the art they generate are necessary, despite the fact it's a totalizing argument. They're not necessary, and that that they are rather contingent or historically generated. This history, this contingent history, which is the logic of contemporary art today, constitutes contemporary art as the prevailing mode of art now. both in general as a field and in particular as any particular instance of art. And I'll take that up in the third talk of the series. So this discussion of art's axioms should not be confused with the discussion of any supposed necessity for art to be what it is and how it is. Normally, usually if one speaks about axioms, that generates, because of the sort of mathematical sense of axiomatics, that generates a sense of necessity of the consequences of the logic of the axioms. And the point I'm making here is that I think contemporary art can be organized or determined through its axioms, but these axioms are themselves historically contingent. Okay? Its logic, contemporary art's logic, is contingent, but no less pressing for all that, and no less organizing and determining for all that. Put the other way, this discussion of art cannot be separated from that of its historically organized structure, which is to say its sociology and politics. Another sub-point, this is certainly, the line of argument I'm presenting is certainly a theoretically led argument and a theoretically led demand on art. And I think that's fine, since there's no need to be particularly observant or dependent on what artists are doing. Okay. And the last sub-point, this is also because art, that I allow myself a theoretically led demand on art. This is also because art is no longer organized or constituted by productivist requirements that art has to be made. I don't think that's the condition for contemporary art or art now. Rather, it's organized and constituted by circulatory and distributional conditions and circuits. Art is coevally discursive, networked. A final introductory comment about these talks and their political demand. What generated this argument, this line of inquiry, is the understanding arising from teaching artists and curators, as well as the usual involvements with contemporary art, openings, friends, discourse generation, institutions, and the rest of it. An understanding that art's contents and claims are now at best placeholders or alibis for a series of power operations to which it is now subordinated, which it serves. These operations are the distribution and power channels within the art world and outside of it, through cultural legitimation strategies, for example, in gentrification, marketization, and also in institutional positioning, and so on. And these power operations are most often not declared as such, but mobilized through the presentation of certain art at certain places at certain times. The art itself is like a chess piece for a set of tactics with no particular global strategy. Apart from the dominant discourses of contemporary art, always assert that the moves being made are a consequence of the art and not of power. And I think there's a fundamental, not exactly hypocrisy, but a fundamental operation of power in secret, which contemporary art serves very well. Power, big or small, hides itself in full sight, justifies itself operationally with contemporary art. And contemporary art allows it, enables that to happen. It facilitates that secret operation of power. Now, all of this secret operation, or what I'm calling a secret operation, isn't in fact that secret. It's certainly well known and somewhat understood in principle, and only occasionally in practice or in fact, depending on the information you have, how included you are within the circuits of the operation of that power. What it means is that if contemporary art is a placeholder, then, even though contemporary art celebrates and affirms art as a series of singularities and irreducible particularities, for this very reason, not despite it, but for this very reason, contemporary art's content need have no criterion or demand other than those that facilitate a move of power and its obfuscation. Art is neither demanded upon, nor does it make any particularly strong demands through its content, nor does it act. But it should. Content is what is mostly taught to in art schools, and also the ostensible subject of discourse of art as having any traction beyond its internal power play. But in contemporary art, content is, I think, and I would assert, only a placeholder. And this is why I would say, in all rigor, it is important for this argument, for this line of inquiry, to not draw upon or run itself through particular works of art. Doing so would not only draw attention away from establishing the axioms and logic of contemporary art in general, but would also mobilize the art as an alibi for itself, which is the standard move of contemporary art. So to be clear, the requirement here is not that art should be observed in its irreducible singularity, that cannot be transposed to broader logics and so on and so forth. That's the claim of contemporary art in its indeterminacy. But that contemporary art is determined by logic, and that the system of this logic is what needs to be understood. Okay? The insistence on contemporary art having to be handled, managed, approached, understood, appreciated only in its singularity and particularity that cannot be generalized, is a way of obfuscating the systemic logic of contemporary art, and I think therefore the power play too. Now on this basis, on the basis that I'm putting forward, the co-determination of the content of art and the field in which it takes place and on which it acts can be made apparent. And the question then is how that ambition is to be realized, and what an art or an art field that takes this demand seriously, what that would be. And the global proposition of these talks is that we must, to get to that, to get to address those points, we must exit contemporary art. That's the preamble. Now, Claire Bishop, this is the first talk in the series. Claire Bishop begins her recently published book, Artificial Hells, a book on art's social term, with this statement from the ever-quotable Dan Graham. He says, all artists are alike. They dream of doing something like, they dream of doing something that's more social, more collaborative, more real than art. And Bishop leaves this statement hanging between what could be understood to be a description of artists' errant ways and beliefs on the one hand, and what on the other hand should be taken to be a true description, pressing description and injunction of what artists ought to do. But Graham's phrase leaves no doubt, if you follow through this quotation, Graham's phrase leaves no doubt as to how the statement is to be understood. He says, this is part of my dream. For real, yeah, for real, I mean for real, isn't it? Not for real, but... And Graham says real here. We can also hear other formulations, such as artists wanting to make an art that is more responsible, or yet more responsible to others, with Dan Graham, responsible to themselves, despite Dan Graham, responsible to ideas, and so on and so forth. Right? To be sincere, authentic, political, just, effective, and so on and so forth. Or to put it another way, to put it negatively, the artist's dream, the dream of art, is to be less private, less narcissistic, less inauthentic, false, socially detached, less abstracted from real, concrete conditions from life, and so on and so forth. And all of this is familiar enough as a set of complaints and conditions and inspirations or forms of practice from about the mid-1850s, if not from the French Revolution onwards. And it takes various forms. The heroes here are Manet, Dada and the Surrealists, Duchamp, Alain Caporal, the Situationists, Suzanne Lacy, the neo-avant-garde, Nan Golding's, post-studio practices, and the participatory practices that Bishop discusses. I think all of these follow the logic. And these are, I think, in general terms, the condition of art's positive attributes, the way in which it has been and continues to be understood to be a worthwhile undertaking with respect not just to art itself, but to broader concerns. Okay? The condition for its social, cultural, and political contribution. How and why art is not just about art, is more than art. The dream, the wish, the edict of an art that is more sociable, more social, more collaborative, more real, is that of an art that is effectively political, a genuinely public art. And for precisely the same reasons, the negative formulations, the insincerity, inauthenticity, narcissism, and so on, the negative formulations of how art ought to be less, all those limited ways, all those limited modalities, in fact is also instructive in that it tells us exactly how and why art is so unsatisfactory, giving specificity to what is problematic in art as it has been and is now. So the negative formulations tell us the problem with what we might call actually existing art. Okay, an analogy with the difference between communism as an idea and the crappiness of actually existing communism up to 1989. So art as it is now, sort of as it's generated by this wish for a more real, more social, less arty art, identifies the problem with actually existing art, the art that we have now. Graham's dream is only one formulation, an expression of the more general edict that an effective art, a genuinely political and engaged art, is not actually existing art. Graham calls this ever greater realism, the commitment to it, the dream of artists. We can also call it, less subjectively, the maxim of modern and contemporary art. It's a maxim and not just a rule, because the artist who makes work in order to realize this dream does so against actually existing art. Put otherwise, actually existing art necessarily falls short of that ambition, or at best only slightly manifests it. It's a ghost of this ambition, of this dream. Now, this maxim takes different guises. One recent and less poetic guises than the one Dan Gray puts forward. One recent and marginally less sentimental version of this same dream, but only marginally less sentimental, of this dream or demand is proposed by two of the editors of Efflux, Anton Vidocqua and Brian Kwan Wood, who say this. This is from September last year. They say, we still look forward to something that can escape the enclosure of the present time, putting themselves then in context of the discussion of commons and kind of communalism, which is prevalent now, I have to say, especially in New York. To escape the enclosure of the present time, not as a messianic hope for a total rupture, but simply as a means of articulating a form of agency that does not lean entirely on the professional superstructure of art in order to come into being as art. Okay? To get out of the professional superstructure of art. Art needs to be, like a better art would be outside of its professional superstructure. They continue, almost all artists, not every artist as Dan Gray says, but almost all artists, still believe, in spite of this cynicism, that a similar break is still possible. And that makes it all right then, doesn't it? And that this break can align itself with a cohesive social project. In the meantime, in actually existing art, we function more like NGO employees who are alcoholic yet naively idealistic. The first step is perhaps to recognize the scale of the system of enclosure that needs to be broken, then its structure, then its openings. For Vidocqua and Wood, actually existing art is necessarily not political enough, not public enough, because it is too institutional. But all is not lost. Motivated by this dream or naive idealism, and it's interesting, dream and naive idealism both point to a kind of subjective determination of the condition for another art than actually existing art. Okay? Motivated by this naive idealism, observing this maxim, art can surpass its current artificiality. Now, this limitation is not just an ontological, formal, or generative complaint, but also a sociological one, that art is too institutional. Under the maxim of its genuine publicness and effective politicality, art affirms itself as it breaks, as it detaches itself from, or better yet, negates institutions. In principle, although only sometimes in fact, art is anarchistic, under this maxim, okay? Or rather, art should be anarchistic under this maxim. Now, even putting aside the fantasy of a spontaneous identity between art and the public, this is the logic of art as an escape. Of an art that is indeterminate enough, institutionally and theoretically autonomous enough, to allow, if not require, subjective completion, public dispute, a cohesive social project, generative of dissensus, and so on and so forth. These are all standard terms and standard logics of what we look for art to do in contemporary art. Okay? Now, this may be a dialectical process to be institutionalized and to try and find non-institutional conditions and manifestations. It may be a dialectical process or a non-dialectical alteration, a dynamic of artistic, aesthetic, conceptual, and institutional transformation, which also maintains something like an identity through all of these changes, because it's still art. But simply, art has a history, and maybe even one without an identity. And I'll talk about that sort of apparent paradox of having an history, still being able to identify something as art, but that it does not have an identity. And I'll do that in the third talk. But for all of the variations and particular manifestation art then takes, smuggling, and again here I rely on some cliches and standard tropes of what's claimed to be art's kind of critical or sort of its traction on, usually on social, political norms and even artistic norms. Okay? For all of the various manifestations that art then takes under this maxim, under this logic of art as an escape. For example, smuggling, exchange without appropriation or expropriation, deterritorialization, in-betweenness, constitutive counternormativity, eventhood, the supernumerary, the uncapturable, the list goes on. For all of that, this logic of escape is also the logic of an endgame. Since a genuinely engaged art is only that which is more real, more collaborative, more social and so on than actually existing art. It's an endgame because although art observing this maxim condemns its current actuality in order to recover its better future, it does so insofar as it also proposes, as it must propose, that art is necessarily, currently and historically, not generally public enough, not effectively political enough. That it is an undertaking that is then made in good faith, but reduced only to a matter of faith. A dream, as Dan Graham puts it, or an idealism, a subjective idealism, as the Efflux guys put it, because its reality, and the reality that it will have, refutes its maxims and its principles. Okay, and that's the structure for maxim. So even the reality of actually existing art refutes the maxim, or kind of falls short of the maxim, but this will also be true of any future art made under the name of, that observes that maxim. Okay? It's a never-vanishing horizon of a real art. Not only does actually existing art refute the maxim of art now, but it is destined to continue to fall short of its maximal anarcho-politicality, which is its real. So under what can then be called art's anarcho-realist maxim, good faith means bad practice, and so does bad faith. So it's a tough gig. This necessary limitation, and this necessity points to, it's necessary because this logic of an endgame, or this logic of escape, this anarcho-realist maxim is an axiom of art, I think. Of contemporary art, rather, not all art, contemporary art. This necessary limitation is sometimes called the circle of critique. The circle of critique, or the terms and operations of a critical art. The frustrations and limitations of which have been articulated clearly by many involved in institutional critique and differently in what's called neo-institutionalism. And it's been articulated especially since the wider approval and integration of that critique by large-scale institutions that they were meant to critique and somewhat undo, if only temporarily, which you can see is an immediately frustrating condition because these institutions have said, thank you for your critique, it's great, we'll incorporate it. Whether it's taken up in that particular form or not, in the form of neo-institutionalism or institutional critique, arts, modern and contemporary, in any case, observe the logic of the returning escapee, the now tired Beckettian cliche of I can't go on, I must go on, which you'll find towards the end of many commentary on the formal, aesthetic and political possibilities of contemporary art. But I think it's important to be clear. Art qua escape returns not necessarily because it is recaptured by institutions, like a beast once escaped from a zoo, or Steve McQueen's character in The Great Escape, although such a capturing also happens and is often how the escape and the kind of restoring of the escaped element into the institutions is phrased as a problem. Rather, it returns to institutions because it is occasioned under a phantasm of a real, of a public, of which it is not really a part. Okay. So it feels like a return because it sets up a logic under this maxim of the anarcho-realist maxim. It sets up a logic in which the real art is that which happens outside of institutions, so any art that's institutionalized seems like a kind of failure or a return or a recapturing of a more real art. The waking reality of the dream of art is that of the institutionalized anarchist, of which you'll find plenty in art schools. Such is the actuality of art now, and also why Dan Graham's open declaration of the dream of every artist, of Vidocq Linwood's belief of almost all artists, this idealism that is almost all artists hold, why these criticisms, apparently, of actually existing art can meet with such approval at the very moment that it is put forward as a criticism too, but also criticism wished for by galleries, museums, academics, collectors, and so on. In support not just of Dan Graham, but also of themselves, of ourselves as moral agents. Stating art's ambitions as a dream maintains their continued validity and aspiration, more real, anarcho-realist. Maintains art's putative politicality under the maxim of anarcho-realism, even while it is presented and supported by institutions that in the logic of this maxim supposedly denigrate such ambitions with their sanctioning, if not conversion of art, into actually existing art. And that's why they are like NGOs who are drunk, because you end up you could only be cynical in this condition. Okay? And the way to cope with cynicism is to be inebriated. The logic of this maxim is particularly appealing because even if it is recognized that actually existing art has very profound and necessary limitations and auto-frustrations with what it is and what it can do in relation to the anarcho-realist maxim, maintaining that maxim, supporting it, upholding it, declaring it, also softens the blow by proposing that art is really, or in principle, an anarcho-realism despite its institutionalization. Okay? You can maintain your idealism despite the recognition that one is always only in actually existing art. That contemporary art is indeed constrained, unable to attain even what it puts forward as its own claims and ambitions, and that something needs to happen to get out of its current situation so that art can be effectively political and engaged with its claims, insofar as these are not only formal or art historical, in a way that is not limited as it is currently by the circle of critique. All of this I take to be a truism and taken as a given here. It's too late to contest the wish motivating Graham's dream. However, a refusal to either repeat, maintain, or continue with this condition requires another logic and set of terms for art than those imposed by its anarcho-realist maxim. Okay? The axioms of art should change. It's a demand. The proposition here, which I'll extend over the next few talks, is that we then abandon art's anarcho-realist maxim, that art not be comprehended against the maximization of anarchy or taken to be contributing to the same, and to refuse all of this while also rejecting autonomy as its counter-condition. As well, I'll develop this in the third talk, since autonomy is no less another formulation of art operating under an anarcho-realist maxim. So the proposition here is that art's real is just its institutionality, taken in a broader sense. Okay? Which also means that art's real is in part, but not exclusively, its artificiality. Institutions are artificial organizations. And that art's real is actually existing art and its circumstances, and that these are artificial, and therefore vulnerable to change, subject to change. Redetermining art in this way means that whatever politics art attains is under the condition that its public and sociality is as artificial, as institutional as art itself. Okay? So art's public is as institutional as art itself, and as artificial and institutional as art itself, and so is its sociality. And I'll take up the institutionality question in the fourth talk. Art's politics then do not rely on a faith in art or an idealism, but in what it is and what it does in fact, crucially including its market conditions, which cannot be dismissed as a limitation or a kind of false fate for contemporary art, or for art rather. On this basis other than contemporary art, other than the anarcho-realist maxim, art does not take up a call for an effective politics that will happen somewhere else than here, by virtue of that effect being that other effect being more anarchic, more real, more spontaneous than art is now, a dream that art itself falls short of. Rather, art is at once actually existing politics without compromise or compensatory claim elsewhere. Even if that politics is not the one that deserves approval according to your convictions, because it is not social enough, collaborative enough, its agency is not autonomous enough, and now, because of its institutional artificiality, because art is almost certainly not real enough. Even if you don't like that set of conditions, that's nonetheless the terms and conditions on which its politics have to be generated and contested. Because there is a politics to be had here. From within contemporary art, or assuming the anarcho-realist maxim, situating art's real to be its institutionality is no doubt a conservatism, and even a reactionary conformism. But the real that is art's institutionality is, I would wager, I'd contend, not necessarily a conformism, and for two conditions. Firstly, and this is, I think, the easy argument, because it's a self-reflexive argument, the current conditions and institutions of art are anyway those of contemporary art. Okay? And these are reliant upon and maintain art in its anarcho-realist maxim. They support and sustain the anarcho-realist maxim, setting up a logic of the returned escapee. The good faith, bad faith, that always means somehow it's never a good enough practice. Okay? So art, observing the anarcho-realist maxim, is its current institutional configuration and form of legitimation. So for that reason, another axiom, art which doesn't fall under the anarcho-realist maxim or follow it, seems to me is not a conservative. An art that works from its institutionality is not a conservative move. It's not a reactionary conformism. And the second reason, which I think is a bit harder, is that nothing suggests that actually existing art needs to approve or conform to current conditions. Just because one is in institutions, and one is an institution, it doesn't mean that one has to continue them in their current formats, with their current politics. While contemporary art requires art to detach itself from its current conditions, up to and including the misfortune, as advocates of contemporary art would see it, the misfortune of its institutionalization in order to better realize itself, art without the maxim of greater realism undertakes the much needed contention of actually existing institutions on the basis not of a dream or a phantasm of art, but of institutions as they are. Okay? It's a politics located and grounded in the present, not in a dream or an idealism. The political task of art can be its negation of unjust institutions and realities, including that of contemporary art in its entirety, which is not simply identified with its institutions. And I take contemporary art to be an unjust institution of the first order. Well, maybe not the first order, fifth or sixth order. There are much worse injustices than contemporary art, of course. Such a negation is a task that contemporary art puts forward only as a maxim, an ambition to be realized elsewhere than through art's institutionalization, and a task that only concerns art itself. Detached from this maxim and the logic it establishes, the task can now be taken up on the basis that this negation is one that has to take place in, through, and for institutions, not despite them. As an affirmation of negating institutions, this exit from contemporary art does not follow the principles, logic, or dynamic of escape. Rather, it affirms that art has a logic, because it has axioms, it has a logic. That it is not the generation of an ever more genuinely public art, which is not anyway artificial and institutionalized. And that it is not in principle autonomously constituted, that art is not autonomously constituted. Its politics are organized, rather, by contesting the adequacy and justice of institutions, including itself. We cannot presume that art is just, or will be just, right, or is done in the name of justice. And it seems to me that's an assumption that often underlies a lot of power abuse and also discourse and critique and criticism in the art system, and artwork too. In this way, art can more thoroughly negate, if we get out of the contemporary art shtick, art can more thoroughly negate institutions in and through their actually existing forms and procedures, rather than on the basis of a dream. Detaching art from its dream or maxim of greater realism, of an even greater publicness, liberates art from the logic of its failure, from its requirement of non-utility, of anti-artifice. We can get out of the expectation of the convention that art should be non-instrumental. All of this is to say that it liberates art from the logic of contemporary art. And this is not a logic of escape for art, nor a negation of actually existing art, but it is an exit from contemporary art. And to do this, we can start by generating another art than contemporary art. I'll stop. The talk itself stops there, but I just want to advertise, I guess, the coming talks and how this one sets up the future ones. This will be about 5 minutes, right? So these propositions and the criticism of the logic of contemporary art, leading to and sort of generating, causing socio-historical inadequacy, is taken up in the next talk via the term contemporary art, the contemporaneity of contemporary art. By the next talk in 2 weeks will be asking what is meant by contemporary. And the reason I'm focusing on that is because while it seems that the designation contemporary art pictures art as being of its own time, or in a complex relationship to its time, and therefore to the history, societies and cultures in which it takes place and to which it contributes, contemporaneity, or the contemporary of contemporary art then being another name for art's traction outside of itself in its now. In fact, the term contemporary art will be shown to be a name for a genre of art. Okay? And a genre constituted, though particularly entrenched, and intertwined modes of indeterminacy. The mistake of contemporary art is to confuse this generic determination of art, the contemporary is the name for genre, with its historical and temporal contemporaneity. Okay, the word contemporary allows this kind of slippage between thinking it's off the time and therefore has traction, but actually it's just the name for genre. In a way, modern art also made the same mistake. As with the argument around art's anarcho-realist maxim, contemporary art will be shown to be unable to gain credible traction to its time, to our time, because of this generic indeterminacy, which is also its claims to singularity, specificity, and unaccountability. And why not justice? Right. In the third session, I'll outline the logic and history for contemporary art and specify how contemporary art is a genre because it has no identity. Okay. It is indeterminate not only for the art itself, per artwork, but also as a non-totality. Contemporary art doesn't seem to be and is not a totality. And this is to follow through on contemporary art's constitutive indeterminacy, and how and why this fulfills a logic set in place by Duchamp's superinflationary sanctioning of an art of non-art, and this assumption of avant-garde strategies of negation within art itself. Art capitalizes upon non-art. And I'll be using Thierry Dedoux's Count After Duchamp for that argument. This kind of configuration, which I'm just skating over now, this is another guise for art's anarcho-realist maxim, but now played out as a history, which also provides an explanation of how and why we are where we are, historically rather than as a logic or through axioms. An exit from contemporary art has to offer another logic than this now prevalent assumed condition for art and its politicality. Okay? So the final talk then returns to art as an institution, arguing that these somewhat theoretical, historical, artistic considerations are also directly socio-artistic, and so are immediately a politics of art. And a politics not only since art is to be maintained in its generic indeterminacy by institutionalization, and therefore by social configuration, one that art under its anarcho-realist maxim seeks to escape in a mock autonomy, or the mock struggle for autonomy. But moreover, and rather, because what art can do is affirm institutions, as I've said, as a site of negation. Okay? And this is a direct politics of art, but it's also another logic than that of contemporary art, and so another kind of art than the one that we have today. Thank you.